All right. Have you ever wondered if there is a puppet master behind the scenes, pulling the strings, directing government where to go, affecting policy without being voted into office? Well, you would be right. And I'm going to go through all of that with you today with my special guest, Matt Palumbo. Matt, thank you for coming on the show today.
Yes, my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me on.
So let me give people just a little bit of background. You're a conservative columnist. You're a content writer and newsletter writer for the Dan Bongino show. You're
Correct.
also a successful author of multiple books that pull back the curtain, show people what the heck is going on with some of these crazy people that want to control the world. The first thing that I wanted to talk about is over the last 3 years, as I've covered the news, I've noticed that liberals have the mainstream media in their pocket. They basically, 70-80% of all content out there is put out by a couple companies that are extremely liberal. Conservative content, on the other hand, has to fight extremely hard to get attention. This was proven with the Twitter files last year. What are some of the lies that liberals get to tell that gets passed around as truth?
Well, they've convinced the public that we're racist and sexist for thinking differently than them. So, I mean, they've convinced the American public of two of the worst possible things anyone could be. And, unfortunately, if it was just the past 3 years, I wish it was just the past 3 years. I think it was the past few decades, and it really started in the culture. They say, I think it was Andrew Breitbart who said politics is downstream from culture, and they have really monopolized Hollywood. I mean, even if you hear a new band on the radio and look them up on social media, if there is a political message, it's going to be liberal 100% of the time. And they've sort of brute forced their own reality. There's this famous quote from, I think it's either Jon Stewart or Stephen Colbert, that liberal or the reality itself has a liberal bias. And if we started from a blank slate and never learned any right-wing beliefs or seen alternative media, yeah, that is the impression you're going to get when almost 100% of the media leans that way. It was the Washington Post had a poll that something like 7% of journalists are Republican. So, imagine a world where 7% of journalists were liberal. What would the stories look like? How would they get reported? And one thing they tend to do to excuse the left scandals instead of not covering them at all is actually the Hill is notorious for this. So if a Republican stabbed a guy, the headline would be, evil Republican stabs guy. If a Democrat stabbed the guy, the headline is outraged Republicans pounce on alleged stabbing or so and so. That's how they do it. They frame it as we're the jokes for noticing. And we'll actually get into that with some of the George Soros commentary later on how they frame these things. But yeah, it's the default. The culture, unfortunately, is left wing. The reporting is left wing. Every sort of facet of life has a left wing bias. Someone observed that any organization that is not explicitly right wing will inevitably become left wing, because there is always going to be in any institution I don't know if cabal is the right word, but group of loud enough people to affect change. And we unfortunately don't do that on our side, and I think should.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I asked a CIA, a former CIA agent once, is there any truth to the CIA infiltrating the mainstream media in order to control the narrative? And he said, no, I don't think so, but they tend to get jobs there when they're done. And so
Yeah.
it's maybe it wasn't on purpose, like Project, Blue Book or, something like
Yeah.
that, but that they end up infiltrating and then they push government policy. And were you as shocked as I was to see how much the Biden administration was coming down on our First Amendment right with freedom of speech, with directly saying, squash this group online, cancel this person, deplatform that person? It's really an affront to our American value and God-given right of freedom of speech. What were your thoughts on the Twitter files?
Well, unfortunately, I'm not surprised at all. And it reminds me, there was this column in the Washington Post by Philip Bump recently called, it was along the lines of you shouldn't do your own research. And my thought was, well, that's because we're just going to prove you wrong. And it's the same exact thing with the Biden administration. I mean, they were claiming that the other day that Republicans are the reason we have a border crisis. And I'm thinking, well, maybe it's the fact that on the first day you reversed every single Trump policy. But reality has become increasingly optional, where within a 5 minute span yesterday, Joy Reid was slamming Republicans for allegedly keeping the border open. And then they cut to a clip of Biden, and she was caught on a hot mic where Biden said, and we really need to, and then she finished a sentence, start another effing war. So I'm like, so you're criticizing Republicans, and then the second it cuts to break, you're willing to criticize Biden, but only when you're off camera, and then she apologized afterwards. So, and then with the CIA as well, there are a lot of groups like the Atlantic Council and these sort of just random private and almost intelligence agencies, they seem like, and they're all staffed by former FBI and CIA employees. And I would say they definitely infiltrate, even if it's not behind the scenes, it's kind of in front of our eyes. They're the ones who are on all the TV shows and pushing policy, and even the ones who are Republicans, they're always like the quote unquote good one when it's on liberal media. It's always some sanitized Republican who sort of represents the Bush era consensus and has nothing in common with us at all.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I have noticed that, where
Yeah.
it's like, if you're a conservative and you're brought on to talk about the Republican Party on CNN, you're probably not a real conservative,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yeah.
you're bought and
Yeah.
paid for.
Yeah, it's the ones who are like, the party. Oh man, I didn't leave the party left me. And I'm like, well, if that's true, thank God, because we don't want to be like you people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
goodbye.
Yep. Yeah. Have a good day.
When I was in college, I remember learning about, during the establishment of our country, the United States, there was a philosopher and an economist named Adam Smith.
Oh yeah.
He wrote about an invisible hand that moves economies forward.
Yep.
I've wondered in the last few years if there isn't an invisible evil hand pushing evil and malevolent purposes on society and our nation. And then I started to learn about this George Soros guy. So tell us more about who the heck is George Soros? Why does he pretend to do good while actually doing harm to the nation?
Well, I have a multi-part answer. I mean, obviously, I can't get inside the guy's head, and I'm someone, and maybe I'm naive and assuming that everyone has the best motives, generally speaking, and maybe they have a different way of getting there. But with Soros, I have to say it's just evil. I mean, when we talk about the destruction of law and order in this country, I mean, what possible good comes out of that? It only could, in some way, have positive effects for him. Now, what the theory is behind that, maybe he thinks chaos will just make people more likely to desperately accept liberal policies. I mean, personally, with the law and order stuff, I think it's the opposite. But then there's also a self-serving element of Soros, in that in a lot of formerly communist countries, he was sort of wrongly praised as helping transition these countries to capitalism. But it was sort of a name only. Soros has been wrongly sort of praised for helping communist countries transition to capitalism. And as I was saying, it's for largely self-serving purposes. So when a communist country becomes capitalist, you have, I mean, probably tens of billions of state-owned assets. And there's the question of, well, who do they go to? And he was able to, through, presumably corrupt practices, buy them up for pennies on the dollar, and, claim to be a national hero, maybe use the Pablo Escobar model of philanthropy, where you build some hospitals and other sort of institutions, but it's really for your own benefit. Actually, the other day, like a month ago, it was before a show on Fox Business, and I was talking to David Asman, one of the contributors, and a number of decades ago, he met Soros at a conference, and Soros was telling him about a recent meeting he had with a bunch of politicians in Eastern Europe, and was talking about how insanely corrupt they were. But unlike you and me, he was talking about it as if it was a positive, as if it was something he could profit from. So, I think that is strong supporting evidence that his business there is for no good. And in fact, he helped the Clinton administration work with the former Soviet Union and transitioning, and obviously for self-serving reasons. So that's the guy.
Yeah, he, I can't understand some of his intentions. So,
Mhm.
for example, he used to try to, I guess, election interference
Mhm.
maybe isn't the right word, but heavily sway the
Mhm.
election
Yeah.
towards liberal, values.
Mhm.
And then he realized, wait a minute,
Mhm.
for significantly less money, I can affect the country by who becomes, the law arm, the district attorney, or something like that. And then all of these Soros backed district attorneys get in. And what do? They start repealing all of these laws and they go soft on crime to the point where now, if I go on Twitter, X, my feed is just full
Yeah.
of stores being broken into, convenience stores being robbed, like just over
Yeah.
and over and over again. And the crime is just spiking, especially in these blue cities.
Mhm.
And so, but why? Why plunder the city? Why create chaos? I guess it doesn't make sense to someone who likes
Mhm.
order.
Yeah,
I guess I
I don't know.
understand.
It's that's all they seem to love, though. I mean, has done billions of damage. You look at, I don't know, their Chaz shop, Paradise, and it was pure chaos. So I don't. It's part of the liberal psychology, and I hate to tell Soros is brilliant, but the brilliance of the sort of going local with the DAs is when you want to influence law and order, they're kind of the final say. And even if you have a state that it has the death penalty, if you're anti-death penalty, you just get a DA elected as anti-death penalty. And a lot of these DAs, they're from a philosophy, and it's not a new one, that criminals are somehow the real victims, that the only way one would be a criminal is if society blighted them in some way, or if, I mean, they speak as if only we boosted education spending or welfare spending 10%, there'd be no crime. And listen, there's far less crime in Eastern Europe, where the average income might be 10 to 20K a year, than there is here. So poverty is not the problem at all. In fact, Albania has the lowest crime rate in Europe, and it's one of the top 5 poorest countries in the continent. So that's really not it. It's a crime of opportunity. We saw in El Salvador, they went from having something like 150 murders for every 100,000 people, which is 5 times more than Chicago, to their murder rate now is 75% lower than America's in our country. So all they had to do was arrest gang members and enforce the law, and we refuse to do that. It is 100% a choice. And then I found that it's like a 90+ success rate with the DAs. Like there are some DAs where he funded with so much money that the opposition just dropped out. And you don't get that with presidential races, where if you and I had $500 million, it's probably not going to sway the vote very much. It's people, I think, actually have gotten the correlation backwards with campaign spending, in that, well, with the exception of the DAs, where at the local level it really works, but on the presidential level, generally speaking, the candidate that attracts more money got more money because they were they were viewed more favorably from the onset. So it's, yes, they won, but they actually probably also would have won without the money. But the DA races, I actually don't know why in one they're really heavily connected, but in the other they're not. But that's just the way it is. And he's been buying races, and we're fortunately seeing some recalls and recall efforts, but it's not by the margins you'd think. And it is depressing in that I don't think there's very much hope in that these people in these cities vote for their own destruction over and over. They oust Lori Lightfoot and they pick something worse. I mean, how is that even possible? I didn't think it was, but apparently it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought the same thing about
Yeah. What's going
this
on?
guy. Go Brandon, right? Oh man. Now you're one of the people that help supply content
Mhm.
to Dan Bongino.
Yes.
I remember Dan Bongino saying something like the cost to the average American
Mhm.
home to live in Biden's America is up
Mhm.
$11,400. So
Yep.
costs $11,400 more
Yep.
to live the same lifestyle in America under Joe Biden as president. Do you remember this segment? Is that true? And why would Biden remain so popular among Democrat voters? Do Democrats hate Trump more than they hate $11,400 more in their bank account every year?
Well, I don't remember the segment, but I have posted that article, and I mean the thing is, it's actually higher now. Um, But well, it must be because it's still going up. And the thing is too, like if you went back to the 1980s and someone were to stereotype the average Republican or Republican voters as rich, it would be true in the sense that there was a more linear correlation between wealth and likelihood to vote Republican. But in the Obama era onward, the coastal elites are now the cultural elites, and that they are the leftists. So the fact of the matter is, they generally are in industries or have financial assets where they're way outperforming under Biden. Biden's approval rating is actually, his economic approval rating is actually fine among like the top 10 or 20% of earners. When you go down to the middle income below, it's really, really bad because they're the ones who aren't seeing their wages go up, and all that. They're the primary losers of all this. So his approval rating under young people and various minority groups is actually far lower than you'd expect for a Democrat. So as long as Trump can hold on to the white vote, he should be fine into November, though I try not to make predictions because I'm always wrong. So I don't know if I should predict the opposite for his sake, but I do think he's a good I don't. I find it very hard to believe Biden could pull off a win.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me just recap what I just heard you say.
Sure.
Under Biden, the rich have gotten richer, and the poor have gotten poorer.
Yeah.
Fact.
Yeah, I mean, whatever wealth they had is down. I mean, the thing is, the government claims inflation is 20%. I wish it was 20%. I mean, when I say 20%, I mean from the day he took office. It feels like 40 or 50%. So whatever, losses to inflation rich people would have would be offset by the stock market. The poor, any wealth they've accumulated, it's generally not in financial assets, and they generally don't own their own homes, so they're not going to benefit from that effect. So yeah, their wages have gone down, and there's just no way there wouldn't be an exacerbation of wealth inequality when the market's at all-time high, wages are falling.
Yeah. Oh gosh. I remember reading in USA Today, this was many years ago, is at the end of Barack Obama's second term. And it said, under the Obama administration, the middle-class Americans have lost 15% of their net worth under his presidency. So this seems to be a pattern. Now, I'll give you this. The stock market typically performs better under a Democrat, but middle America usually performs worse under a Democrat. Those are basically facts as well.
Yeah, there was a study by Alan Blinder on this, and he was looking at every like metric, and I can't remember, I think it was of the stock market as well. And he was like, Democrats, and this guy's a Democrat himself, and the conclusion was, it is true that it does perform better under Democrats, but there are so many variables beyond the president's control, like even things like weather or, are there a bunch of attacks on oil refiners in the Middle East? All these little things that you have to account for. And he was like, it's basically a wash. It's basically even once you account for luck, basically. So, yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so you've got a new book out, The Man Behind the Curtain. This goes into great detail on the secret network that George Soros and his family has set up. What would we learn by reading The Man Behind the Curtain? And why did you write it?
Well, I've been fascinated by the guy since I feel like it was 2010. Glenn Beck was talking about him on his show, and I know got a lot of blowback for it. So I just kind of thought, well, there must be something with this guy. And my publisher, me and Bongino, were kind of talking about book ideas and settled on this. And it's, I mean, both I would say it's a biography, a very critical biography. So I start by going through his life. I cover the sort of infamous Nazi story and just how he got his wealth, what, ideological statements he made early in his life. And then I just move on to, he spent tens of billions of dollars, and here's where it's going. And I talk about universities he's funded, both here and funded and founded both here and overseas. I talk about the presidential campaigns he's meddled in. The longest chapter would be on law and order and all the woke DAs. And if I mentioned every single one, it would take up the entire book. So I just sort of make a list of the worst. And it's like like a baseball card of awfulness on I divide it as like, here's what they publicly said, and then therefore attracted Soros's money. Here's how it got implemented, and here are the effects. and none of them are good. So it's generally, we saw in 2020 and 21 like a doubling of crime in cities as a whole, but it was worse in the Soros-backed ones. And whenever liberals today claim crime is going down, if you look at the chart, it's like that, and then that is it going down. So it's yeah, it might have gone down, but it's still on net up like crazy. And then what else? And then I talk about like there's a whole chapter on leaked documents from the Open Society Foundation that were published, and I sort of went through them and just highlighted those. And at the end of the book too, I have just a table of organizations where you can just reference if you see one and wonder if it's funded by him. And then one thing too that I think is good that people will like is I talk about his connections to the Biden administration and how that showed up in policy and that kind of thing.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Well, we'll look forward to that.
So.
Final question, Matt. His son Alex has now been gifted his entire empire, his company, all of the networks and infrastructure, and about $25 billion. He's also been raised with the lens that most humans are bad. The population needs to be cut in half. That we are the virus ruining planet Earth. What do you see over the next 10 years as he takes real control of all of that money and that infrastructure?
Well, I mean, the bare minimum would be every single thing is maintained that they have today, all the funding, so it can really only get worse from there. The hilarious thing about him taking over is, and everyone watching this has probably been called this at some point, where if you criticize Soros in any way or read through public filings where he says exactly where his money is going, you're called anti-Semitic. And then if you go to his son's Instagram page, it is just it's like a who's who of world leaders that he posts photos with, and it's as if he's mocking us. Like, yeah, you can call me, I'll call you an anti-Semite all you want, even though I'm doing this in front of you. I think him in particular really doesn't want the attention. If you have watched him speak, it's there's more ums and uhs than there are words. So he just doesn't appear to be a very confident individual. And in the Wall Street Journal piece where they broke the story, he was quoted as saying, trying to moderate his image and say things like, well, I think the left has gone too far in being against free speech and all that. And well, your father funds all those organizations that push cancel culture and all that. So I didn't hear you say, oh, yeah, and I'm going to stop funding them. So, until we see it, it has yet to be believed. And I would love in the future to do a book on him. I just sort of have to, unfortunately, wait to see what he does. And my requests for an interview have not been returned.
Well, we know he'll do something. He'll give you plenty of material.
Oh, God, I hope. Well,
Palumbo,
I was going to say, I hope so, but for the sake of humanity, I also hope not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. I'm going to put a link to your book down below. Where can people follow you online to keep in the loop on what you're writing about?
So I'm not really on my personal Twitter. I'm trying to have a life, but it's mixed results. I post to the Bongino Report Twitter. BonginoReport.com is mainly like all my articles get posted there, even though they're my personal name.
Okay.
But yeah, those two sites pretty much.
Okay, I'll put a link to that down as well.
Excellent.
Thank you so much for coming on, and thank you for writing this book so that we can all understand who this person is. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
You as well. Thanks so much for having me on.